If you've noticed that the people you walk with always seem to be a step or two ahead of you, if you're constantly the one everyone has to pause for at the corner, or if a walk that used to feel effortless now leaves you winded before you've even reached the end of the block, then what you're about to hear is going to change the way you think about walking, and it starts today. Because the truth is that most people who feel this happening to them assume it's simply the inevitable cost of getting older. A quiet decline they're supposed to accept without question, and yet the medical reality tells a very different story, one that is far more encouraging and far more actionable than most people realize. And to understand it, imagine yourself out on a walk with a close friend or your spouse, trying your best to match their pace, except your legs feel unusually heavy, almost as if you're wading through water. Your stride has shrunk into something short and shuffling. Your breath is coming faster than it should for such a simple activity, and somewhere underneath all of that effort, a quiet worry starts to form. A question you may not say out loud, but that sits there anyway, wondering whether this is simply what aging feels like now, whether this slower, more effortful version of walking is your new and permanent normal. And if that thought has crossed your mind even once, you are far from alone. Because this exact experience is one of the most common and most misunderstood signs of physical aging. And the good news, the part that almost nobody explains clearly, is that this slowdown is not some vague, unfixable consequence of the passing years, but something with a specific, identifiable, and correctable cause. A cause that researchers have actually studied in enormous detail. And one of the clearest pieces of evidence comes from a landmark study published in 2019 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which followed more than 34,000 older adults over an extended period of time, and arrived at a conclusion that surprised even some of the researchers involved. Because walking speed on its own, simply how quickly a person moves from one point to another, turned out to be one of the single strongest predictors of long-term health and longevity that scientists have ever measured. So reliable and so revealing that many in the medical field now refer to it informally as the sixth vital sign, right up there with blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, breathing rate, and oxygen saturation. And what makes this finding so useful is not just that it identifies a warning sign, but that it points directly toward a solution. Because the same body of research found that the slowdown in walking speed was almost never caused by some vague, generalized weakness spread evenly throughout the body, but instead traced back again and again to the loss of two very specific mechanical functions: the power generated by the calf muscles during push-off, and the ability of the hip to extend fully behind the body during each stride. And once researchers identified these two mechanisms as the primary drivers of the problem, they were able to test targeted interventions, and what they found was remarkable, because seniors who worked specifically to restore calf propulsion and hip extension didn't simply become faster walkers. They reported walking with noticeably less effort, less discomfort, and a level of confidence they hadn't felt in years, and many of them experienced these changes within as little as 4 weeks of consistent practice, which is a remarkably short window for something that many people assume is a permanent, one-way decline. And this exact protocol, built around rebuilding those two mechanical systems, has been used for years by one of Japan's most experienced physicians specializing in the health and mobility of older adults, a doctor who has guided countless patients back toward longer, more confident strides. And tonight he's here to walk us through the very same process step by step, so that anyone listening can begin applying it in their own life, starting with their very next walk. And as the conversation begins, the host welcomes the doctor back to the show and notes that this particular subject feels deeply personal to so many people who tune in. And the doctor agrees immediately, explaining that walking speed is not simply a number on a stopwatch, but something much closer to independence itself. Because the moment a person begins to slow down, their entire world has a tendency to quietly shrink along with it. They stop going out as often. They stop exploring new places. They start turning down invitations that once would have been an easy yes, all because the physical act of moving through the world has become something to dread rather than something to enjoy. But he's quick to add a note of reassurance, explaining that what he's about to share proves that the underlying engine driving human movement isn't broken at all. It simply needs the right kind of tune-up, delivered in the right order, and the host responds that this really does resonate, because nobody wants to be the person that the rest of the group has to wait for at every corner, every doorway, every crosswalk, and the doctor agrees completely, adding that this feeling of constantly falling behind creates its own kind of anxiety, a low-grade tension that causes people to stiffen up physically, which in turn makes them walk even more slowly and cautiously, creating a frustrating cycle that feeds itself over and over again. But today, he says, that cycle is exactly what they're going to break together, piece by piece, by rebuilding push-off power, unlocking a longer and more natural stride, and giving people a tangible, physical difference they can feel on their very next walk outside. And before diving into the actual exercises, the host invites everyone listening to participate directly, encouraging them to pause for a moment and leave a comment with the number 1 if they've noticed themselves slowing down over the past several years, or the number 2 if they've noticed their steps becoming shorter and choppier than they used to be. Because whether someone identifies more with shuffling steps or simply a general sense of sluggishness, the underlying solution turns out to be exactly the same, and the host shares a small personal example of their own, mentioning that they notice this most clearly when trying to cross a street before a signal changes, that sudden burst of speed that used to come so naturally, now feeling completely out of reach. And from there, the conversation moves into the structure of the session itself, with the doctor explaining that over the next several minutes, he'll guide listeners through 5 specific exercises designed to restore what he calls the walking engine. Starting with a simple weight-shifting drill, meant to build basic confidence and coordination. Moving next into work that specifically targets the calves, which he describes as the body's natural gas pedal, then shifting focus to the hips in order to lengthen the stride, and finally finishing with a dynamic movement that ties every previous exercise together into one smooth, coordinated motion. And before any of the actual movements begin, the host asks a foundational question that sets up everything to follow, wanting to know exactly why this slowdown happens in the first place. What is physically changing inside the legs that gradually transforms a long, confident stride into a short, hesitant shuffle? And the doctor explains that this is precisely the question most people never get a clear answer to, because most assume the slowdown is simply the result of general aging or fatting energy levels, when in physical reality walking is powered by something closer to an engine made up of 2 distinct components working together, propulsion and drive, and after the age of 60. Both of these components tend to weaken at the same time, which compounds the effect far beyond what either one would cause on its own. And when the host asks what this means in terms of actual muscles involved, the doctor breaks it down clearly, explaining that propulsion originates in the calves, which function essentially as the body's gas pedal. Because every single time a person pushes off through their toes while walking, the calf muscles fire in order to project the body forward into the next step. And when those calf muscles weaken over time, that forward pop simply disappears from the stride, while drive, on the other hand, comes primarily from the glutes, the muscles at the back of the hip that pull the leg backward and use that motion to propel the entire body forward and over the leg that's currently in contact with the ground. And if either one of these systems weakens, whether it's the calves losing their push-off strength or the glutes losing their pulling power, the entire walking engine loses a significant portion of its overall output. And the doctor adds that there's another factor working against people as well, one that has nothing to do with muscle strength directly, but everything to do with modern lifestyle habits. And that factor is simply sitting, because years spent sitting for long stretches at a time gradually tighten the muscles at the front of the hip, stealing away roughly 10 degrees of hip extension that the body needs in order to take a genuinely long stride. And when a person can no longer extend their hip backward through that necessary range, they physically cannot take a long step forward either, which forces the body to compensate with short, choppy, shuffling steps instead, a pattern that becomes increasingly inefficient, increasingly tiring, and increasingly slow the longer it persists. And the host summarizes this by noting that it essentially means the body is working harder just to cover less ground than it used to. And the doctor agrees completely, comparing the whole situation to driving a car with a weak engine while the parking brake is still partially engaged, technically capable of moving but fighting resistance the entire way. And yet he's careful to emphasize that despite how discouraging that description might sound, the actual engine underneath all of this is not broken in any permanent sense. It is simply deconditioned from years of underuse, and deconditioned systems can absolutely be rebuilt with the right approach, starting immediately. And with that foundation established, the conversation moves into the first exercise, which focuses entirely on weight shifting as a way of building the basic confidence required before any real strength work can be effective. Because the doctor explains that a great many seniors walk slowly not purely because of weakness, but because they've developed a subtle hesitation around fully transferring their body weight onto a single leg at a time, choosing instead to linger in what's known as the double support phase of walking, the brief moment when both feet are in contact with the ground simultaneously, simply because that position feels inherently safer and more stable. But walking at any real speed requires the willingness to trust one leg fully at a time, if only for a fraction of a second, and this first exercise is specifically designed to rebuild that trust from the ground up. And the doctor walks listeners through it step by step, instructing them to begin by standing in a comfortable position, holding onto a chair or countertop for support if needed, and starting with something as simple as lifting one heel off the ground and then the other, alternating back and forth in a smooth, steady rhythm similar to a gentle pedaling motion, keeping the toes in contact with the floor throughout this initial phase. And this simple motion serves to wake up the ankles while establishing the underlying rhythm that later movements will build upon, gently teaching the brain that shifting weight from one side to the other is a safe and manageable action rather than something to be cautious of. And once that motion begins to feel smooth and rhythmic rather than tentative, the doctor instructs listeners to progress into a small marching motion, actually lifting each foot an inch or two off the ground rather than simply raising the heel, shifting weight fully onto the left leg while lifting the right, then revering the motion, training the brain and body together to trust each leg individually as the weight shifts back and forth. And as this movement starts to feel more natural, the goal becomes increasing the speed of the rhythm as much as can be done safely. And to make this concrete, the doctor introduces a simple test, asking everyone to set a timer for 30 seconds, or simply count along together, and to count exactly how many of these small marching steps can be completed within that window, while maintaining full control and safety throughout, explaining that whatever number comes out of this test becomes each person's personal baseline moving forward, and once people have had a chance to try this for themselves. The doctor offers some general benchmarks for context, suggesting that those between the ages of 60 and 70 should aim for somewhere around 20 to 25 marching steps within 30 seconds, while those over the age of 70 might reasonably aim for 15 to 20 steps in that same window. And he notes that anyone who can reach 40 steps within a full 60 seconds is demonstrating genuinely excellent weight-shifting ability, a level of coordination that translates directly into how quickly the feet can move during actual outdoor walking. And for anyone who finds themselves falling short of these numbers right now, he offers simple reassurance, explaining that daily practice of this exact movement will allow the nervous system to gradually learn and adapt to the required speed over time. And with that foundational drill firmly established, the conversation shifts toward the second exercise, the one specifically designed to serve as what the doctor repeatedly refers to as the gas pedal of the entire walking system, because this exercise directly targets and strengthens the calves. And the doctor explains that if you watch a younger person walk, you'll notice a strong, confident push-off through the toes with every single step, whereas in a frailer or more elderly gait, the foot often lifts almost completely flat off the ground instead, a subtle but telling sign that reveals a meaningful loss of calf strength. And without that push-off power, a person ends up essentially dragging their body forward with each step, rather than actively propelling themselves ahead. And to reinforce just how significant this particular muscle group really is, the doctor points to a 2021 study published in the Journal of Geriatric Physical Therapy, which found that calf muscle strength stood out as the single strongest predictor of walking speed among adults over the age of 70. And the same research found that seniors who performed targeted calf strengthening exercises 3 times each week saw their walking speed improve by roughly 15% in just 6 weeks of consistent practice. with the researchers ultimately concluding that push-off power really does function as the primary driving force behind walking velocity in older adults, which means rebuilding this specific muscle group offers one of the most direct and effective paths back toward a faster, more confident stride. And with that context established, the doctor walks listeners through exactly how to perform this movement safely and effectively, starting by having everyone stand facing a wall or a sturdy chair for support. Explaining that this particular exercise actually comes in two distinct levels depending on current strength and ability, with level 1 performed using both legs together, feet placed roughly hip-width apart, and from that position the goal is simply to rise up onto the toes as high as possible, almost like a ballerina rising onto point, squeezing the calf muscles firmly at the very top of that motion, which is exactly where the real power of this exercise lives. Before lowering back down slowly and with control, and the doctor emphasizes that this slow, controlled lowering phase is just as important as the rise itself, because rushing through the descent essentially wastes half of the exercise's strengthening potential. And when it comes to how many repetitions to perform, he stresses that volume genuinely matters here, since the calves function as endurance muscles built to carry the body through an entire day of activity. So the target should be somewhere around 20 to 25 repetitions performed consecutively, continuing until the muscles genuinely feel fatigued by the end of the set, because stopping well before that point of fatigue means the muscles aren't being sufficiently challenged to actually grow stronger over time. And for anyone who finds they can complete 25 repetitions with relative ease and barely feel any fatigue at all, the doctor introduces level 2, the single leg heel raise, which he describes as noticeably more difficult, but also the true power builder of the two variations, performed by lifting one foot completely off the ground, hooking it gently behind the opposite ankle for balance if that helps, and then pushing up onto the toes of the single standing leg, a motion that closely mimics the exact moment during actual walking, when one leg alone has to bear and propel the entire body's weight forward. And he notes that even successfully completing 5 clean repetitions of this single leg version represents a genuine and meaningful victory, building real, functional strength that translates directly into daily movement. And he encourages consistent daily practice of whichever version currently matches each person's ability level, explaining that over time this will produce a tangible gas pedal response felt directly during real walking. The kind of response where a person no longer has to consciously think about walking faster, because their legs simply carry the physical power needed to do it automatically. But he's also careful to point out that propulsion alone only represents half of the overall walking engine, which sets up the transition into the next exercise focused specifically on drive, the second essential component working alongside propulsion. And the doctor explains that this next movement is specifically designed to wake up the glute muscles, which tend to fall into a kind of dormant state after years of frequent sitting. And he describes how most seniors develop a very specific and problematic combination over time: tight hip flexors along the front of the hip, paired with weak, underactive glutes along the back. And this particular combination does serious damage to stride length over time. Because when the hip can no longer extend fully backward, the resulting step gets cut noticeably short, eventually settling into the same kind of shuffling pattern discussed earlier in the conversation. And to begin correcting this imbalance, the doctor instructs listeners to stand tall while holding onto their support with both hands, stressing that maintaining an upright posture throughout this entire movement is absolutely critical to its effectiveness. And when the host asks why upright posture matters so much here specifically, the doctor explains that the movement about to be performed involves moving the leg backward, and if a person leans forward while doing this, they end up unintentionally cheating the movement, essentially faking the range of motion using momentum rather than actual hip mobility. And he shares a helpful tip he gives his own patients directly, suggesting they place one hand on their lower back while performing the movement, explaining that as the leg moves backward, the lower back itself should remain completely still, neither moving nor arching in response, because if it does move, that indicates the spine is compensating for the motion rather than the hip joint doing the actual work. And the entire point of this exercise is to isolate that movement purely within the hip joint itself. and the host confirms understanding by repeating back the idea of keeping a hand on the lower back specifically to monitor for unwanted movement. And the doctor confirms this is exactly right before continuing with the actual instructions, explaining that with legs kept straight throughout, the goal is to push one leg directly behind the body. And he notes clearly that this will end up being a fairly small movement in terms of visible range, often only a matter of a few inches. But the size of the movement doesn't diminish its importance in the slightest, and at the very end of that small backward motion, the instruction is to squeeze the glute muscle firmly, using the mental image of squeezing a pencil gently between the cheeks, holding that firm squeeze for a full second before releasing and returning to the starting position. And the doctor points out that the human hip naturally only offers about 10 total degrees of extension to begin with, which might sound almost insignificant on paper, but reclaiming even that modest 10-degree range represents the entire practical difference between a short shuffling step and a long, confident stride. Because when that extension is available, the leg is able to reach further behind the body with each step, which in turn propels the body further forward with every single stride taken, and anticipating a common issue people run into with this movement. The host asks what to do if someone feels a cramp developing in the back of the thigh rather than the intended muscle group, and the doctor explains that this sensation typically indicates the hamstring attempting to take over a job that actually belongs to the glutes, a very common compensation pattern that occurs specifically because the glutes have become so underactive from years of sitting, and his recommended fix is simple if the hamstring starts cramping during the movement. Relax the foot completely rather than pointing the toes, and redirect focus entirely onto the glute squeeze itself, because with consistent practice over time, the glute muscle gradually takes over its intended role, while the hamstring naturally relaxes out of the compensation pattern it had fallen into. And as for repetitions, the doctor recommends performing 10 to 15 controlled squeezes on each side individually, and once this standing version has been thoroughly practiced, the conversation moves into a fourth exercise that isolates the exact same glute muscles even more precisely than before, this time by removing balance and gravity from the equation entirely, allowing the focus to rest completely on raw muscular strength rather than stability or coordination. And this particular version of the movement is performed lying face down, either on a bed or on a mat on the floor, with the head resting comfortably on the hands or on a small folded towel positioned under the forehead to keep the neck relaxed throughout. And from this position, the goal becomes lifting one leg using only the hip muscles themselves. And when asked how high the leg actually needs to travel, the doctor is quick to clarify that height is not the objective here at all, and in fact represents the single most common mistake people make when attempting this exercise, explaining instead that the leg should remain perfectly straight while being lifted only a few inches toward the ceiling, just enough to feel a firm squeeze through the glute muscle, because attempting to lift the leg any higher than that almost inevitably forces the lower back to arch or the hips to twist in order to generate the additional range, which completely defeats the purpose of the exercise by shifting the workload away from the glutes and onto the spine instead. Meaning precision matters here far more than range of motion ever could, and to help people find the correct amount of lift, the doctor offers a simple visual cue, asking listeners to imagine a full glass of water balanced carefully on their lower back throughout the entire movement, explaining that this imaginary glass should never spill, and if the lower back arches at any point during the lift, that's the clear signal that the leg has been raised too high, so the instruction becomes simple: squeeze the glute. Lift just a few inches, hold for a full second, then lower slowly and with control, repeating this for 10 to 12 repetitions on each individual leg, while really focusing attention on the connection between mind and muscle throughout, essentially teaching the brain to fire the glute muscle directly without quietly recruiting help from the lower back muscles instead. And this precise, isolated strengthening work builds exactly the kind of raw horsepower that the overall walking engine ultimately depends on. And once this foundational strength work has been established across both the calves and the glutes, the conversation moves into the fifth and final exercise, which serves the specific purpose of putting the entire walking engine into actual motion, rather than working each individual component separately. And the doctor describes this final movement as one of his personal favorites, specifically because it closely mimics the real coordination and rhythm required during actual walking, while simultaneously challenging balance and stability at the same time. And the setup begins with one leg, for example, the left, remaining completely stationary as a kind of anchor point, while the right leg becomes the active leg performing the actual movement. Stepping forward first, while shifting body weight fully onto that forward leg, and then immediately reversing direction, pushing backward and stepping behind the body with that same leg, creating a smooth, continuous forward and back motion without ever fully stopping in the middle of the movement. Almost like the steady swing of a pendulum moving back and forth in a consistent rhythm. And the doctor emphasizes trying to fully clear the stationary anchor foot with each pass, stepping meaningfully past it rather than just barely brushing by. And as confidence and coordination build over repeated attempts, the instruction becomes to gradually lengthen each step, while also increasing the overall speed of the movement. And this specific combination trains the brain to transition smoothly and rhythmically between the drive phase and the propulsion phase of walking. Essentially rehearsing in a controlled setting the exact balance recovery skills required when walking at a genuinely brisk pace out in the real world. And the recommended approach is to continue this movement for 30 seconds on one leg before switching sides, with the goal of completing somewhere between 8 and 10 full cycles, counting one complete forward and back motion as a single cycle. And the doctor notes that anyone who can comfortably hit that target range is genuinely ready to take this new stride confidently out onto the sidewalk and into real-world walking. And as the conversation begins winding toward its conclusion, the host invites everyone listening to share their own personal results in the comments section, along with where they happen to be tuning in from, offering a simple example format such as mentioning a name, a location, and the specific numbers achieved during both the marching test and the step-through cycles, framing it as a fun way to see just how strong and engaged this particular community really is. And when asked how quickly people can realistically expect to notice a difference from consistent practice of these 5 exercises, the doctor offers a clear and encouraging timeline, explaining that performing this full routine every other day tends to produce a noticeable difference within roughly 2 weeks for most people, with the stride gradually opening back up, that familiar push-off sensation beginning to return, and the frustrating experience of constantly lagging behind starting to fade into the background. And he closes with a simple but memorable piece of guidance, reminding everyone that consistency will always outperform intensity when it comes to rebuilding this kind of foundational strength and coordination. And that if the engine itself is rebuilt properly and patiently, the speed that so many people feel they've lost will naturally follow right along with it. And the host thanks the doctor warmly for walking everyone through such a clear and actionable process, encouraging anyone who found the episode genuinely helpful to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this in the future, before signing off and teasing an upcoming episode that promises to build directly on everything covered today. With both host and doctor expressing genuine enthusiasm about what's coming next and inviting listeners to join them again for the next installment of the series.